So in part 3, chapter 3. Now, I said something yesterday. I think I was confused. And I think what I said probably was very confusing, so I'll try to do it again. Ruach HaKodesh, he says, is an experience where a certain piece of knowledge is delivered, and this knowledge is clear, without any doubts, without any mistake, and it's known completely, causes and its effects, everything on its own level. That's called Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit. And I mentioned that we understand, the great medieval commentators and codifiers had Ruach HaKodesh. So someone asked, and I myself said, but that doesn't mean that everything they said was true, because what will you do with cases of contradiction? One scholar says A, and another scholar says A is not correct. So, and if Ruach HaKodesh guarantees truth, they can't both be right. Even more, what happens when a scholar changes his mind? Did he have Ruach HaKodesh both times? He himself says, I made a mistake, I'm changing my mind. They can't both be right. So the content of the Ruach HaKodesh cannot be, this pshat is the truth. That can't be the content of the Ruach HaKodesh. So the content of the Ruach HaKodesh has to be something less than that. I said some words yesterday which were in this ballpark, but I don't think it was all clear. For example, let's say I'm working on a certain problem in interpreting a passage, and I have certain rules that I use to determine what to say. I'm looking for an explanation that fits my rules. That's what I'm looking for, an explanation that fits my rules. And then I come up with an explanation. I say, this is it. It could be that I have Ruach HaKodesh for that. I have Ruach HaKodesh that my explanation fits my rules, and it may very well fit my rules. And somebody else has different rules, and his explanation fits his rules. Neither of them is certified as true. They're just certified as one that fits my rules. I'm not making a logical mistake in applying my rules. I might be ignorant of something. I might be ignorant of another alternative. And then, if I had thought of the other alternative, I would have changed my mind. So, this fits my rules. There might be something else that fits my rules better. Not being given a guarantee on that. The Gemara often asks about an Amora, well, how would he explain a particular brisa? And the Gemara discusses it. And when it comes to the conclusion that the Amora cannot explain the brisa, often the conclusion concludes, the Gemara's conclusion is, Tiyufta, he's refuted, and his position was wrong. Say the commentators, because it is not assumed that all the Amoraim knew all the brises. They didn't know those brises. So the Gemara's state is raising hypothetical. What would he do with this brisa? And then, if there's nothing plausible that could be done with the brisa, as far as the Gemara can tell, the Gemara is saying, Rabbi Chaim says this, then the Gemara is saying, if he had known this brisa, he would have changed his mind. And that's why we reject what he said. He just didn't know this brisa. So, the siyata d'shemayu, or the Ruach HaKodesh, that the scholars have in doing their scholarly work and arriving to conclusions, does not include a certification that what they say is true. And perhaps the great root of this general idea is a famous ritva. The Gemara talks about a certain difference of opinion, and it used the words Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. There's a difference of opinion. These and these are the words of the living God. I have a footnote to put in here, but I'll come back and put it in later. These and these are the words of the living God. But there are two contradictory points of view. Two contradictory statements. How could they both be the words of the living God? Now, there are several explanations of this, but the Rif's explanation is this. This issue, he actually says, B'chol Dover, God communicated to Moses considerations on both sides of the issue. He says 49 each. So let's say the question is whether this thing is tahor or tameh, pure or defiled. God communicated to Moses 49 reasons that it should be tahor and 49 reasons that it should be tameh. In the discussion, in the debate on the issue, when one says it's tameh because of this, the other says it's tahor because of that, both of those statements are true. They're both true. This feature is a feature that leads to tumah, and this feature is a feature that leads to tahara. That's both completely correct. Because Baruch didn't tell them whether the thing is tahor or tameh, he only told them the considerations that lead to the two conclusions. So when the Gemara says, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim Chaim, these and these are the words of the living God, what it means is all the considerations that are brought to bear on the subject are the words of the living God. But when you finally come to the conclusion, where one says the thing is Torah, one says the thing is tameh, those are not the words of the living God. Those are the opinions of the Amora, and one could be right, one could be wrong, because that's not guaranteed by the Ruach HaKodesh. So again, as an example where when you identify the activity of Ruach HaKodesh in the context of the of scholarship, it doesn't include a certification that what you're saying is right or wrong. And I'll just finish with this, and then give you the footnote. I'll go back to the footnote if I remember it. Given what I told you yesterday, there can't be Ruach HaKodesh, and certainly not Nevuah, that a certain halacha is right, because prophecy and Ruach HaKodesh can't be the authority by which a halacha is decided. It's out of bounds. It's out of order. So HaKodesh Baruch Hu is not going to create a misleading experience where he tells the person this is the right halacha when his being told by God can't settle the halacha. It can only be settled by human debate and human vote. So that can't be the content of the Ruach HaKodesh and the Nevuah. Now, what was I going to tell you? Forgot already. Yeah. Okay. So, question. Yeah.
So, would you say that Hashem gave over the rules how to come to a conclusion and left it up to Rabbanim to?
Well, that's true. Some rules of how to come to conclusions were communicated from Sinai, but there are differences of opinion how to formulate the rules. So it's not pure. It's not pure. Whether you use klal and prat, or whether you use ribu and miut, is a classical machlokes throughout Shas. So it's not. You can't escape the problem that way. Yeah.
One thing, Rabbi, you were trying to make a side note on divrei Elokim HaChaim.
Yes. Thank you very much. Oh, very good. Well, you picked that up very well. I'm not going to give a whole share, so I wanted to make a point, and of course these words are illustrated. Very often, people discuss some topic in the Talmud. The topic is formulated with certain words, and then the discussion starts. And he's arguing this way, he's arguing this way, they're bringing applications. And as they talk about it, their words change. The words change into something that's shorter, simpler, and clearer. And then the discussion evolves into discussion of the new formulation. And often people don't stop and think, now wait a second, that's not what the Talmud said. And since what we're talking about now is shorter and clearer and more precise than what the Talmud said, don't we have to ask why the Talmud didn't say the shorter, clearer, and more precise thing? Why it said the longer and vaguer thing? And that maybe by changing the formulation, we change the subject? So what happens in the case we just discussed, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. These and these are the words of the living God, which is said in the context of a controversy. And the puzzle is, how could two sides of a contradiction both be true? They can't both be true, so it seems. So how could this be correct? People don't stop and ask, now wait a second. We're discussing how they could both be true. The Gemara didn't say they're both true. It didn't say that. It said, these and these are the words of the living God. Man, that's vague, hey? That's really vague. What does that mean, the words of the living God? True is shorter, simpler, clearer, and the Gemara didn't say it. Oh, well, if the Gemara didn't say it, then maybe that's not what it meant. And maybe raising the question how they could both be true is just a mistake, because the Gemara didn't say they're both true. This goes on over and over again. I have a dozen examples of this, where people take what's said in the Gemara and then switch it in their minds to something clearer. They go off talking about that, and they don't ask themselves, why didn't the Gemara say the clearer thing? Maybe it doesn't mean the clearer thing. So here I just gave you an example of true and but be very careful when you paraphrase something in your mind, you work on it with your formulation, that you haven't changed the subject. That's my footnote. Yeah.
So we're saying that God gave over at Sinai the reasons to say tahor or tameh, but didn't give over the halakha.
That's what the Ritva says, and he says it in the name of the European scholars, which and by the way, the Ritva was a master in Kabbalah, in addition to everything else. He knew Greek philosophy, and he was all over the map. And he credits it to them. And I agree with you. I don't understand what those words mean, and I've never seen them explained. He says, "B'chol davar," in every instance, in every subject, God gave 49 here, 49 there, and left the halacha up to the Chachamim. I can't understand that. I agree with you. Obviously, he told us to, various things that we have to do. It's certainly not true that he didn't give us any exact instructions. So I do not know what he's talking about.
Would that mean it's all subjective? It's just up to the person to see what he thinks is best?
No, it would not mean it's all subjective. The fact that a person has to exercise judgment or use his intelligence to figure out the answer doesn't mean that it's subjective. This is one of the most awful philosophical bungles, which usually occurs to college sophomores after the third beer. Well, I'm just thinking it right, so it's only my opinion. It's not even an opinion, it's just a feeling, and nobody's opinion is better than anybody else's opinion. Right. Tried that in court, But I didn't think I was speeding, so why are you giving me a ticket? I didn't mean to speed. It's like, why are you giving me a ticket? Thanks a lot. No, it has nothing to do with being subjective. There are lots of things that if you have an opinion, the opinion is just wrong, So the fact that you have to make up your mind, it's sort of like people say, you say it's 3 feet long, but you invented feet. You invented feet, so it's just your invention. It's no bigger than you are. No, I invented the measure, but the table is the table. And in feet, it's 3 feet. Not 6 feet and not 24 meters, it's 6 feet, period. End of story. Right? Okay, well, I'm not going to teach you all of that philosophy now. Yeah, where did you get it so far? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now, we talked so far about Ruach HaKodesh. And then he says, in paragraph 3, that there are very, very many different levels of Ruach HaKodesh. But in every one of them, I wanted to say this also, and every one of them is with absolute clarity and absolute certainty, etc., etc. Now, the Rambam, when he discusses this, I think he brings this later also, says there are certain terms that are used technically in a certain formal setting, and then they're used colloquially, and used much more loosely, and without all of the commitment and the trappings. And people talk about Ruach HaKodesh when they have an inspiration. Boy, oh boy. That was really Ruach HaKodesh. I had this inspiration, and it came to me out of the blue. The light bulb goes on, which is a very good image. That's the way it feels. Like, you didn't create it. It just hit you. The idea hit me. Also, wonderful words. They're experientially quite correct, right? And then, surprise, surprise, it turned out to be right. That's not Ruach HaKodesh, boys and girls. There's no surprise. You know right away that it's right. You know of certainty that it's right. if it's surprise, it turns out to be right. That wasn't Ruach HaKodesh. But people say, since I didn't invent it and I couldn't explain where it came from, so it came out of the blue, like Ruach HaKodesh. People use these words in a vague way. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about it as a technical term. And although prophecy ceased 2,500 years ago, roughly, the beginning of the Second Temple, but Ruach HaKodesh has not ceased. So there is divine inspiration, and divine inspiration does enable knowledge to be acquired. The Chafetz Chaim, who died in 1933, said several times before he died, the First World War was child's play. Approximately 15 million people were killed in the First World War, and 60 million people were killed in the Second World War. Sounds like he knew something. He knew something was coming. No one else predicted that. No one predicted a gigantic war with 4 times as many people dead. He knew something was happening. That's Ruach HaKodesh. As he said, one of the features of Ruach HaKodesh is to be able to tell the future. So that's not missing from our world. Oh yes, in the next paragraph he says exactly what I said, right? Hargosh is a feeling about something, doesn't know where it came from. So people call that Ruach HaKodesh in a generalized sense, but that's not what we're talking about. Now, above this is another level called Nevuah, prophecy. And he says the definition, the concept of prophecy is that the person is connected to HaKodesh Baruch Hu and attached to him with absolute attachment. This is a metaphysical statement. We didn't have anything about that in Ruach HaKodesh. We didn't talk about a relationship with God, or attachment to God, or connection to God. None of that was mentioned. All we had was, there's a certain influence coming from God which produces knowledge in the person. The big difference here is, where does it happen? The big difference is that Ruach HaKodesh applies to a person in his own context, in his own realm, in his normal environment. Whereas Nevuah is where the person escapes his environment. Ruach HaKodesh is an influence from God that comes down to him, and Nevuah is where he escapes his environment and attaches himself to HaKodesh Baruch Hu. One visible difference between them, which the Rambam describes in detail, is what happens to him during the process. During the process of Nevuah, the person is totally out of control. He falls on the floor, he can't stand up. He loses control of his muscles, he loses control of his senses, he loses control of his mind. He's totally out of control. His physical reality is non-functional. And this is all aside from Moses. Moses was separate in very many ways. But this is all other prophets other than Moses, this is what happened to them. And that means that if Ruach HaKodesh comes to you in your world, then to a certain extent, what you get is filtered through your world, which will limit how much you can get. If you're taken out of the world, those limitations don't apply anymore. Now, he explains as follows. He's attached to HaKodesh Baruch Hu in such a way that he perceives the attachment, and he understands that that's what's going on. And what he's attached to is something called kvodo. Again, he's quoting the Rambam. Kvodo, God's honor, God's glory, God's majesty. Kvodo. What does it mean to be attached to a kavod, to glory or majesty or honor or something like that? The Rambam says that word kavod here refers to something created. It's a created thing. So you know that this is something that's created by God, and through attachment to it, you're relating to God, because strictly speaking, attachment to God is nothing but poetry. God isn't the kind of thing you could be attached to. So when you say you're attached to God, that has to be explained. So it's a little bit like, let's say, you're working together with Beethoven on his Fifth Symphony. And you have various parts that are being written and revised editions and so forth and so on. And then finally, Beethoven finishes it and sends you the finished copy. The finished copy of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? You read the notes, you play it on the piano, you experience some of it and so on. Well, it's not just paper. You're connected to Beethoven. Because this symphony expresses Beethoven. Now, of course, Beethoven's a person. You're not hugging him. But on the other hand, you're attached to the thing about him which may be more important than hugging his arms in his chest. And that is his music. So the kavod is something like that. The HaKodesh Baruch Hu created a thing in the world. That thing you can perceive an attachment to as relating to a created thing. But that thing is created by God and being used to mediate a certain relationship with God. And that's the metaphysics of how Nevuah works, how prophecy works. And again, he says there's something which is absolutely clear and proceed from him without any doubts. Now he says, he gives him powers, and like this is all the Rambam, so much, so interesting that he follows him so closely. He says, just like you have no doubt about what your senses perceive. Now maybe some of you have learned to play philosophy. Philosophy is a frivolous game that you play when you're not too serious about something. But let's try this. You're sitting in a room on a chair. Some of you are leaning on a table. Try to doubt that there are tables in the room. Try to doubt it. Are there or aren't there? I wonder. What probability would I give this? 92%? Could be wrong, you know. Now, the way the philosophy game goes is think of the possibility how you could be wrong. Well, it could be a dream, right? Or you could be hypnotized, right? Could be, right? But you can't take that seriously. You could say the words. You could think the clever thought that it might be. Well, you're leaning on the table. There's no doubt that the table is there. Mm-hmm. You're not worried. You don't think, maybe I shouldn't lean because I'll fall through the floor because it's only an illusion, right? You can't work up a doubt in your mind. So the game of philosophy, like David Hume said, when you go out into the street, you don't play the game if there's no such thing as causation. that game you don't play. You watch out for the cars. And you don't step out the window on the 16th floor and wonder whether gravity will pull you to the ground. You don't do that. Now, why is this important? Because the Rambam uses this. You could use abstract things like 2 + 2 = 4 also. But he also uses the chushim. The Rambam says the proof that the experience of prophecy is beyond doubt is that Abraham, on the basis of prophecy, was willing to take his son to kill him. Were there any room for doubt, he would not have done that. From this we see that for the prophet who experiences it, there's no room for doubt. Now, let me explain to you, I think, how the idea of no room for doubt works. Let's try. Maybe, really, this isn't the table. There aren't tables here, maybe. Or maybe I'm really female. Or maybe I'm really Chinese. Or maybe I'm really living at the same time as the discovery of America in 1492. I'm just mistaken about various things, right? If I start to take seriously that maybe I'm female, or maybe there are no tables here, or maybe I'm Chinese, then I've got to take seriously that nothing I know is correct, that everything's wrong. I can't rely on anything. And then all thinking comes to a halt. If there's nothing that I can rely on, then my life just goes to zero. I can't do that. No one can do that. That's, I think, one way to articulate the idea that you can't tolerate this doubt. Because this doubt is like an infection. It spreads. And once it spreads to the point where all thinking comes to a halt, that's not something you can do. Perforce, you're going to think and you're going to make decisions. You're going to try to find out what the truth is. So this is something where doubt just doesn't apply. So that applies to prophecy as well.
Isn't that what liberalism is?
I'm sorry?
Isn't that what liberalism is doing? Spreading out their doubt. Liberalism. There. I don't know. Not politics. Never mind.
Liberals don't doubt truth. They doubt a truth other than theirs. But they don't doubt truth. Nobody doubts truth. You can't doubt truth. Because your doubt would be incoherent. How would you express your doubt? There's no truth? Really? And that's not true either? How would you express yourself? And there's no consistent way. This is pablum. We teach this to first month in philosophy. Right? This is nothing deep here. Okay. So now, a person. I should have said this also yesterday. He talked about preparation for receiving Ruach HaKodesh, and of course preparation for prophecy also. But as the Rambam says, and he says, maybe everyone agrees, prophecy is not automatic. Nor is Ruach HaKodesh. You can go through all the preparations, and the HaKodesh Baruch Hu can say, I'm not giving it to you. Without the preparations, you're not going to get it. But with the preparations, you may or may not get it. And, of course, prophecy may happen once in a lifetime, or it may happen regularly. It may happen only in certain areas, not in other areas. The same with Ruach HaKodesh. Be limited for different people with different people for different areas. Now, the question arises, and Rabbi discusses this in detail. He's describing the inner experience of prophecy. A person who's a prophet has a certain authority. He can give orders, and you have to obey. Elav tishma'un is a verse. He can command you to do anything short of idol worship. Eat cheeseburgers, go to war on Shabbos. He can and you have to obey. Whether he has to give the command in the name of a prophetic experience now or not is a difference of opinion in the Rishonim. But when he's legitimately expressing such a command, you have to obey. In order for that to be true, you have to be able to identify who is a prophet and who isn't a prophet. How do you do that? So, the Rambam in Yeshivat Ohr says the following. How do we know that Moses was a prophet? Is it because he did miracles? No. It's not because he did miracles. Now listen carefully. I've had several times people quote this Rambam wrongly to me. He says, because miracles could be falsely attributed to magic. He doesn't say they could be magic. In Hilchos Avodah Zarah, he says magic is phony. It's just illusions. It has no reality whatsoever. Somebody who is supposed to have some scholarly background told me, well, he believes in it himself. He says it could be magic. No, he doesn't say it could be magic. He says someone could attribute to magic. That doesn't mean that the attribution is true. So, how was it established? Established for the public that Moses was a prophet? By the fact that the Jewish people overheard his prophecy. They experienced his prophecy themselves. They observed it themselves. And the Rambam describes it as God talking to Moses and the rest of the Jewish people hearing God talk to Moses. So the reality of Moses' prophecy is not a question. However, for no other prophet in the history of the world did that happen. No one heard God speaking to Isaiah or Jeremiah or Yoshua or anybody else. So how do they get to be recognized as prophets? And the answer is Moses gave us rules. And the rules are roughly this. If the person himself is a scholar, and if he performs the commandments to a certain level, both of those, and he demonstrates some kind of supernatural ability, he can either do something or predict something or explain something, know something which other people can't know. And then he says, God told me X, Y, Z, and this is what you must do. Then you listen to him and you do what he says. Now, the Rambam here is very careful. And in fact, the words I spoke in the last 2 minutes may be a little bit incautious, maybe a little bit, have to be refined a little bit. The Rambam says, let's suppose somebody passes all these criteria. He's a scholar, he fulfills the Torah, he has some supernatural ability, and demonstrates it, and then he says, God told me something, and here's what you must do. Do we know that he's a prophet? Maimonides says no. All you know is that he has the legal requirements to be treated as a prophet. Because he fulfills the legal requirements, you are required to do what he says. And he likens this to a judge who's judging a case of a criminal action, and there are witnesses, and the witnesses give their testimony, and the judge cross-examines the witnesses, and they survive the cross-examination, and now he's going to punish the criminal. Does the judge know that the criminal committed the act? Says the Rambam, no. He doesn't know that. He wasn't there. What he knows is the legal criteria for punishment have been met in the conduct of the case. And we're in exactly the same position vis-a-vis the prophets. So we loosely say, if they passed all that, then we call him a prophet. But the Rambam is very, very precise about it. This is how all later prophets get their authority. They get their authority by leaning on Moses. Without Moses' rules, without our trust in Moses' rules, we would never identify them as prophets. Now, having said all of that, what do you think the reception would be to a person who said the following? Listen, guys, I'm a prophet. Here's my scholarly credentials, and I have a record of keeping the mitzvos. Let's see now, you want something supernatural? Let's see, I'll just make something up. Come with me to the park, and I'll take a stroll on the lake. How's that for an imaginary idea, huh? A brand new idea that hasn't been heard in the history of the world. I'll take a stroll on the lake, on the surface of the lake, and you'll see. I can do that. Nobody else can do that. She takes a stroll on the lake. Terrific. Okay, Sir Prophet, what is your message for us? The first message I have for you is not everything Moses said is reliable. Not everything Moses said is up to date. Not everything Moses said is valid. What kind of reception do you think he's going to get? Listen, fella, the only reason I would have to treat you as a prophet is because Moses said so. If you're going to tell me I can't trust Moses, goodbye. Have a nice day. Leave me alone. That's one of the reasons Christianity had such a bad record in preaching to Jews. The early Christian groups were sent, it's one here in Eretz Israel and one in Syria. The one in Syria was preaching to Romans, and the one in Eretz Israel was preaching to Jews. Because they were preaching to Jews, they did preach keeping all the commandments, or almost all the commandments, at the beginning. The ones in Syria were having trouble. Tell a Roman to circumcise. As an adult, I'll get a Greek mystery cult. Leave me alone, right? They wanted to break away from the mitzvos. The ones here said you can't. But the ones in Israel were doing very badly. And one reason they were doing very badly, because a person with a minimal Jewish education knew right away this is an impossible message. So that's the one sense, at least, in which all prophecy leans on Moses, and that's how we know who are prophets. He's talking here about how the person who's experiencing it knows he's a prophet. And I was talking externally how we know. Are we together so far? Okay. Now, he says, again, the definition, the essence of Nevuah is the attachment to God. Now, he's taking sides on a difference of opinion here. Is prophecy a function of communicating God's will to others? Is that what prophecy is? Or is that just something that some prophets do and some prophets don't? Some want to use the word novi from nivs vasayim, the motion of the lips, as if they have to speak. But the Rambam and the Ramchal both say that the essence of Nevuah is not communicating to somebody else. The essence of Nevuah is being attached to God in a certain way, receiving a certain influence from God, receiving certain understanding and knowledge from God. Maybe he'll send you on a messenger job, and maybe he won't. That's not part of the definition of prophecy. So that's very important to understand. Now we have the list of the prophets and so forth and so on. That's because they communicated. Had they not communicated, we wouldn't know. And just as a matter of background, FYI, from the time everyone at Sinai had prophecy, men and women and even children. After that, the oral tradition tells us from Sinai, the 1,000 years till the beginning of the Second Temple, there were 1,200,000 prophets, 600,000 men, and 600,000 women. So prophecy is definitely available to women, at least in equal numbers as it is as to men. And they were prophets. They were known as prophets. The ones that we have are just a few dozen, because they were the ones who spoke and whose words were relevant to future generations. And that's why they were preserved. All the rest were available to Jews for information or communication from God, which was pertinent only to them. So, for example, the Ramban says, during the 1,000 years, no Jew went to a doctor. Let's say he had a physical problem. A physical problem is always the result of some spiritual disorder. Medicine will tell you, don't treat the symptoms. Treat the disease. They understood that. They went to the prophet and said, what does God want me to fix? The fact that we don't have prophets is why we have to use doctors. And it's okay to use doctors. But before that, it would be an abomination to go to a doctor. So the prophecy was very widespread. If you have 1,200,000 prophets in 1,000 years, every Jew could be in contact with a prophet or prophets. The whole quality of living the Torah was different from what it was thereafter. That's the presence of prophecy in the Jewish people. And since then, we're living the residue of that experience. And this, in comparison to Ruach HaKodesh, the types of information that you get from prophecy are much higher, much more fundamental, much more basic in terms of their relationship to the way the universe runs than what you get in Ruach HaKodesh. Now he says, this connection to God's glory, whatever that thing is, which then mediates the connection to God, is not direct. There are intermediaries in between the person and the kavod. That doesn't make it impossible for him to know that it's the kavod, but there are intermediaries. And different prophets have different numbers of intermediaries and different types of intermediaries. And the intermediaries create distortions so that the vision isn't perfectly clear. It's just that the prophet knows what the distortions are, so he can discount them. So, for example, let's suppose you have a lens that lets through only black, white, and gray light, no colors. He doesn't think that the stoplight is black. He doesn't think the grass is black. He knows that they're different colors. He knows he's getting a black and white figure. So he can get size and shape and orientation and motion. He doesn't make a mistake and say, but that must be blue. No, he knows he's not getting the colors. So it doesn't cause him to make a mistake, but it causes him to lose information. You go to the places where they have these funny mirrors, curved mirrors, right? And it distorts your shape. So you look in the mirror and you know, if somebody's looking at that reflection, he's not getting my shape, because that's not what the shape that I have. So if that's the picture you get with the distorted shape, then you say, okay, so a shape I'm not getting. Size and orientation I might be getting, and shape I'm not getting. He knows where the distortions are. So he's not misled, but he thereby knows that there's a certain degradation of the information that he's getting. Moses had one clear lens in between himself and the other, with either no or almost no distortion at all. Now, there's a tzaddik who explains how the distortion comes about in spiritual terms, which I think is extremely fundamental. Imagine, this can happen in the daytime also, but it's much clearer at night. You're in a room where the lights are on, and there's a window out to the street. When you look out the window, what do you see? Well, the truth is you see two things. You see, if there are street lights on, it's illuminated outside, you see what's going on outside, but you also see a reflection of what's in the room. You get a partial reflection from the glass. So you get a double image. And the fact that part of what you see is a reflection from the room interferes with what you see outside. And if you're standing 90 degrees directly at the glass that you're looking through, then the reflection you see from inside the room is reflection of yourself. That's where the distortion comes from. Because you project yourself into the image. That's what causes the distortion. And then Moses' picture was clear because he didn't have any of himself in the picture. He removed himself entirely from the picture. This is one of the things indicated by the famous expression in Chazal, Shechina medaberes mitoch grono. God's presence spoke from Moses' throat. It isn't that God told Moses something and he said it over. No. God's presence was speaking from his throat. And by the way, when you think about it, when it says in the Torah itself that God's interaction with Moses was on a level completely unlike any other prophet, one of the things it says is, Peh el peh adaber bo. Mouth to mouth, I speak with him. Really? Mouth to mouth? That's how you speak? Last time I checked, it was mouth to ear. He speaks with his mouth, and I hear it in my ear, mouth to ear, that mouth to mouth. But no, it's mouth to mouth, because God's voice comes out of Moses' mouth. That's how he speaks to him. So this is the spiritual, the moral spiritual element in the distortion. It's having the self, and the nullification of the self is the way to purify the picture. And Moses achieved the maximum purification that a human being could achieve. And that's one of the reasons why Moses had the greatest level of prophecy that ever was and ever will be. If somebody tells you the Messiah will have more, he's wrong. Capital W. Yeah.
Would you say that's also why, or maybe the reason also that he didn't have to fall on the floor or go to that place?
Why he didn't have to fall on the floor? He says it's like a person talking to his friend. There's a lot of things going on here, and I don't know how they all fit together. Even in the normal prophet's mind, there are two sections to the mind, the intellect and the dimyon. Okay, what dimyon is a whole story. And in a normal prophet, the influence from above comes to his intellect, goes from the intellect to his dimyon. When the process stops, there's a disconnect from the influence above to the intellect, and the residue is in the dimyon. That's what he takes away from the experience. In Moses' case, the dimyon wasn't involved. It wasn't involved in the prophecy at all. So we're talking about a different metaphysics, talking about a different quality of interaction altogether, and I don't know how to put it all together in a single picture. Yeah.
It wasn't quite clear how we explain the Rambam. So, like, if let's say Moshe never existed, would miracles be enough to believe somebody's a prophet?
No.
Why? Because it might be magic.
No. Again, he's not talking about whether it's enough or not. He's talking about how he established himself as. And when there are people who can wrongly think that these miracles could be attributed to magic, then he won't be established, because that critique will be articulated and people will have doubts. Here, Moses' prophecy, and this is explicit in the Torah. God says to him, I'll come to you, I'll speak to you, so that they will hear me speaking to you and they'll believe in you forever. Without that, they won't believe in you forever. So the Rambam explained, because this corruption of the idea will take hold, and the idea will fall into doubt. And when you actually experience it, when your grandfather says, I was there, Charlie, I saw it, don't tell me anything else. So that's and if you think about it, the fact that Moses' prophecy has lived at all, that just didn't die out, is quite remarkable. We're talking about 3,300 years. with a lot of different history. And not only the Jewish people, a certain section of the Jewish people faithful to it, being tiny minority and persecuted and scattered and all the rest, but the basic idea of Moses' prophecy is part of the belief system of those Christians who are left that believe, and the whole Muslim world, which is probably 2 billion people anyway. That's a big impression, right? But without that, how many people claimed prophecy and then they were just forgotten? They're ignored. Yeah.
We said that all the Jews had prophecy at Sinai, but doesn't the Rambam say that the Jews didn't actually hear God speak?
No, he does not. What he says is they didn't hear words. They did hear him speak, they didn't hear words. There's a difference, right?
I thought he said,
If you speak to him in Chinese, I'll hear your voice, but I won't hear words, because I don't know where to segment them and where the words are. Kol devarim atem shomim. The voice of words, Rambam's Madaik, it always says kol. Kol dvarim, that they heard is explicit verses. He does not say that. One of the many things that people paraphrase the Rambam and get it wrong. He explicitly says they heard, but they didn't hear words. The experience they had, which is extremely important. Okay, all right, that's introduction to the idea of prophecy. There's much, much more to talk about. We'll pick it up again tomorrow.